Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Genevieve Kessler, and I'm the State Strategy Lead for the Refugee Advocacy Lab and the Director of State Advocacy with the IRC. I'm pleased to be here today to kick off this session on language access policies. Hopefully you've received the written menu of options entitled Language Access, Precedent and Possibilities in U.S. States, Counties, and Cities. If you've not received it, you can find it on the resource page of the Refugee Advocacy Lab for reference. While many of us in this field have recognized the gaps in language accessibility, COVID really put a spotlight on the needs for that in state and municipal government. These entities face challenges in translating urgent public health information, making sure that communities were aware of masking and social distancing requirements. And this has inspired new conversations among elected leaders of how can we do better. Of course, that takes a village to make that happen. So we're pleased to have you register today so that we can share our findings of what policies have worked and what hasn't worked at different levels of government. So today we'll be talking through an overview of that comprehensive guide, which was drafted by our presenter, Rose Healion. Annie is the Nevada advocacy consultant with the lab and the IRC. Annie will be joined by Sylvia Nyumuhungu, the Michigan Lab State Lead, who will share her experience directly supporting municipalities when their language access policies were insufficient and fell short. Please note before we get started that today's webinar will be recorded and also posted to the resource page of the Refugee Advocacy Lab. You may add questions to the Q&A section along the way, but we have reserved time at the end of the presentation to respond to those. And with that, I will turn over host privileges to Annie.
Hiya, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm so excited to share this policy brief with you all today. Before we get into that, we're going to hear from Sylvia, who will discuss her experiences with language access.
Thank you so much, Annie. I'm very, very honored to be here today. I'll be talking a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing here in Michigan, locally, when it comes to just advocating for language access, specifically for the refugee and immigrant community. My work has mostly been focused in West Michigan, to be specific, Grand Rapids, Michigan, and also partner with other places of the state, like in Detroit and Dearborn and other parts. So just to start a little bit, I'm a former refugee from Rwanda. My family and I migrated here 10 years ago, and I and my family had to learn a new language in order to navigate the system here. And it's not something that as you're immigrating here as a refugee or as an immigrant, you're thinking about, like, you know, like, I am going to come here, and one of the main things that it should be on my mind is language, because you're thinking about finding shelter as a refugee, finding safety for your family and your loved ones. So language becomes something that is an important skill to have to thrive here in the United States, but something that is not as a priority until you're here. And you, over time, you know, we realize that language access is a basic need. It's like breathing, you know, like in order for you to survive in this country, you need to be able to speak the language here. And a lot of immigrant, like a lot of refugee parents, usually once they arrive here, they depend on the younger family members who usually go to school here and are able to pick up the language soon. And you find like younger people being interpreters at their homes and stuff like that. But a little bit about just language access in the state of Michigan. When we arrived here as refugee and immigrants, traditionally we have access to language resources through social services and resettlement agencies. You find that these are the places where they have interpreters on site and have content interpreted in different languages based on the communities that they're providing services to. But as refugees, we only get support through resettlement agencies once we arrive here, only for 3 months or 6 months, depending on your situation. So you get those the access to constant interpreters for 3 months and 6 months, and after that you let go, and then it's up to you to figure out how you're going to find someone to help you with interpretation, or how you're going to be able to interpret just and navigate around this new community without having access to an interpreter, or you being someone who speaks English as your first language. So schools also do a good job of providing interpreters. It's required when you're going to school and you're during like parent-teachers conferences, or like students in class. You're in ESL classes, and you also have like interpreters who are ready to explain things to you on site, and your parents as well when they're coming to the schools. Hospitals also are other places that you find traditionally have access to interpreters. It's required for you to have an interpreter for a patient at hospitals when that patient doesn't speak English that well, in order for you to be able to treat them. That's a law here in Michigan, and I've been able to experience that as well since I've worked as an interpreter before for a while, and that's something that's practiced well. But other than those like basic areas, schools, hospitals, and social services, the rest is like you have to navigate for yourself. So in 2020, we had our elections over the whole country. And one of the biggest issue that we ran into here in Michigan is realizing that our voters, our refugee voters, or poor refugee voters and immigrants were having a hard time with accessing information. First, we were for accessing information that was interpreted in the languages that they understood. And also it didn't help that things were virtual. That didn't help at all. So I partnered with a lot of community leaders and interpreters to make sure that our community had access to information on why their vote mattered, how to vote, what's on the ballot, how to register to vote. These are information that I think you would assume that, I don't know, people have access to, but it's all mostly printed out in English or communicated through in English. And sometimes if interpreted, it's interpreted in like Spanish and like and other languages, but not the languages that most of the refugees who are in the state of Michigan speak. So I was working with interpreters and community leaders to host workshops in different languages, explaining the voting system, explaining the ballot, explaining how to register to vote, and all that, and making sure that our communities had access to that information so they can be able to make educated decisions, and they felt supported. So if in Michigan also, we learned that you can bring a family member with you to register to vote. I mean, on the day of voting, you can bring a family member with you if you need someone to help you interpret. But we also ran into the issue of the fact that if you can't speak English, you can't bring anyone else unless they're a family member to help you vote. So what we did was access the ballots earlier before the day of election and try to explain what was on the ballot so that people, when they go in those places to vote during the day of voting, they are aware of what they're doing. Another thing that we did was during the pandemic was efforts around COVID-19. So obviously a lot of the community of colors and refugees and immigrants were hesitant towards getting vaccinated, but a big part of that was just not having access to information. So our state here did a really great job interpreting information and printing them out and sharing it to like communities in different places on what the virus was, and when the vaccine came out, also what the vaccine was, what was in the vaccine, and why people were getting 2 shots instead of 1 or 1 instead of 2. But even that was difficult because individuals weren't able to access those who didn't have technology or access to like connections with like, I don't know, emails and all that kind of stuff. It was difficult for them to get that information. So that was one of the biggest challenges we saw, is that even though the state was interpreting content, how was that content going to directly reach individuals in the community directly? And also we realized that a lot of refugees, even though they speak, let's say Kinyarwanda or Swahili or Burmese, some of them are not literate in the languages that they speak because they didn't get a chance to go to school while they were in the refugee camp. So we realized that even though the state was doing printing out interpreted information about the vaccine and the vaccine resources, not many people were able to understand that because they didn't read in their mother tongue. So we created videos. We started working with community leaders and created videos and spread information around the virus, the laws are being implemented, the sanctions are being put in place because of the virus, and when the vaccine came out, also we did interpreted videos and explained what was in the vaccine, what the vaccines were, and then we spread that information through WhatsApp and other places in person, to just making sure that everyone had access to that. So it's really important that as we're thinking about access to language access, remembering that a lot of refugees might speak the language, but not be able to read in that language. So being able to interpret that information through a form of video so they'll be able to access that is very important. So overall, some of the challenges that we ran into is we recognize that there were no system in place to deal with things like encouraging civic engagement and dealing with social issues that are affecting our communities when it comes to language access, and making sure that our communities are able to receive information in the language that they speak, especially during the pandemic and the voting process. So it's really, really important that we're intentional moving forward with incorporating and systems that will make it easier for those who don't speak English as their first language to access information around who is running for office, how they can register to vote, how they can become US citizens, and all that kind of stuff. And also just making sure that we have content that individuals can be able to easily understand, and just not like printed out words that 3-page of printed out information that people are not able to read. So recommendations, honestly, is just like being creative with how we're producing systems to be able to provide equitable language access opportunities. And also one thing that came out of our work is community navigators. So we learned that the health departments and local offices really need to be working with the community and making sure they have like people in the community who can be able to spread information through a word of mouth, through home visits and all that kind of stuff. So we were able to advocate for people that were calling community navigators, and these are people that are from different immigrant groups, different refugee groups who speak English and speak a different language, are in the community every day, making sure that people have access to information in the language that they speak through one-on-one home visits, but also just spreading content and creating content themselves through a form of video and spreading those in the community. So these are some of the local things that we saw in the past year or so, and some of the ways we try to help with language access here in Michigan. Yeah, I won't take any more time. I'm going to pass it back to Annie, and she'll talk more about her studies.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. And I think it's always really important to remember how much language access impacts our lives. So I'm going to share my screen and start presenting this policy brief. All right. Cool. I think everything's working. There we go. All right, so the policy brief was designed as a survey of language access policies and practices across the United States. And this was created in order to provide advocates, policymakers, stakeholders, and communities substantive and tested strategies and tips for language access policy and practice. The structure of the policy brief and of our conversation today builds into 3 categories, so state, county, and local level policies. And of course, our conversation today will follow this chronology. Moving forward, just before we start, I think speaking also to what Sylvia said, language access is really important and it serves our communities. So more than 21 million people speaking at least 350 languages across the United States are limited English proficient, which means that they are not fluent in English. You'll hear me a few times refer to the acronym LEP populations, but that's what it refers to, limited English proficient. Representing representing the diversity, courage, and perseverance of the United States, LEP individuals are valued and important members of our communities. Unfortunately, LEP individuals are often confronted with language barriers when accessing public resources and services. By connecting LEPs with services and institutions, language access facilitates the inclusion, well-being, safety, and success of our communities. It's also a fundamental component of civil rights, a key part of functional public policy. It's a legal requirement and a judicial precedent, and it's really a great way that we can serve these LEP communities. So moving forward, on the state level, language access has been codified and supported through a variety of efforts. State policies are helpful as they establish a clear context and administrative structure for language access. We recommend pursuing state legislation. So legislation, meaning laws enacted by the legislature. You'll hear me refer to that a few times. So on the state level, think state legislature. On the county level, think commissioners. On the local level, think city council, or executive action. So on the state level, governors, local level mayor, that sort of thing, referring to executive policy and executive agencies. So we recommend using these on the state level if a state does not have existing language access policy or plan. Administrative oversight and technical expertise are required for language access implementation. State agencies, counties, or other municipalities ubiquitously fail to offer language access services, or if additional funding is needed to support statewide efforts. So moving into examples, and these are pulled from the policy brief, which of course has more examples and goes into them a little bit more in depth. We're focusing here on some strengths and limitations found in state policy. So Guam, Hawaii, and New York have used the administrative and directive power of the executive branch to enact some pretty progressive language access policies. It's important to note here and kind of throughout that language access policy often matches the local political and population dynamics of a region. So Guam, Hawaii, and New York are very diverse places. Hawaii and New York are fairly progressive, but this also isn't to say that language access is limited to progressive places. Guam, for example, language access was enacted by a Republican executive branch. So really, it's not a partisan issue, although sometimes it can be, but it's not a partisan issue and doesn't necessarily have to be tied to specific population dynamics. Another strength is assessing existing policy and establishing implementation mechanisms. You'll hear me talk about implementation a lot today, but really implementation is important because it translates policy into practice. Language access is often an ongoing process. So language access policies will be enacted, practices will be assessed, and then we'll go back to the policy drawing board. I think this is really evident in the ongoing process in California's Damali a la Torre Bilingual Services Act, which has been ameliorated, adjusted, and edited from 1973 until today. So really ongoing process. Some limitations found in some state examples include limiting language access to frequent languages. Of course, it's important that frequent languages receive language access resources, but it's important that people who speak maybe less frequent languages in a service population still receive access. So New York's executive orders in 2011, which limit language access to the 6 most spoken languages in the area, and 2021, which are the 10 most, are great, as in they offer resources to these 6 and 10 most spoken languages, but we need to have accommodations for people who speak less frequent languages to ensure that language access is as inclusive as possible. Also limiting language access to languages spoken by available staff. So again, while hiring multilingual or bilingual staff is a great way to pursue language access, it's important that there are accommodations for when those staff aren't available, or if they speak a language that isn't necessarily served in the service population. So moving forward to the county level. County level language access policies connect language LEP populations with county services, including voter registration, tax collection, and administrative oversight. These policies are especially important in unincorporated towns or rural population centers, so places that might not necessarily have a city council. We recommend pursuing county level policies if county services are an express need by LEP populations. If county level targets are more amenable to language access policy, we'll discuss an example from Suffolk County. If it's an election year, so counties typically have oversight over registering voters and conducting elections, or in municipalities where city policy is impossible. So again, places that don't necessarily have city councils, like unincorporated cities. So moving forward into some examples. One of my favorite examples, and I'll say this a lot, but one of my favorite examples comes from Suffolk County. So tailoring strategy to local political realities. Suffolk County's language access policy, albeit imperfect, was a significant policy achievement for a county whose previous executive espoused xenophobic views. Suffolk County's path to language access illustrates the importance of identifying potential and political leaders. So the county's new chairman was key to shifting policy and rhetoric in the area. Also including and clarifying the use of technological aids. So technology often offers a cheap and accessible language access resource, but it's important that policies regulate the use of tech and chart the boundaries of when tech can be used. Very simply, Google Translate isn't enough. Some good examples of this are in Jefferson County in Alabama and Multnomah County in Oregon. This also leads into a very important point that policy needs to be clear and concrete. A good example of this is in Orange County, California. Some limitations are kind of the flip side of this. So vague and insufficient implementation and accountability measures lead to policy not turning into practice. A good example of this is in Nassau County in New York, which the Executive Order 67, despite being a great language access policy, didn't really translate into serving limited English proficient individuals in the area because it didn't have these implementation and accountability measures. Again, also limiting access to frequently spoken languages. We want to make sure that language access is as inclusive as possible. So let's move on to the city level. City level language access policies ensure local engagement, they connect LEP populations with municipal services and facilitate local implementation. We recommend pursuing city level policies if existing state and county policies do not provide robust language access services on the local level. If cities in neighboring regions with similar demographics have successfully adopted language access policies, we'll talk about a great example from Brighton, Michigan, or if the city is home to a large LEP population. Although again, it should be noted that the amount of LEP individuals in a city should not be a barrier to language access. All LEP individuals deserve language access, regardless if they're 20 in a service population or 2,000. So some city examples. So some strengths that we found. Brighton, Michigan, again, another one of my favorite examples, but Brighton, Michigan is a great language access success story. So it's a city of only 7,650 people, which has voted Republican in every presidential election since 2000. At a cursory glance, it's not necessarily a place that you would assume would adopt a language access policy, yet Brighton has a comprehensive language access policy and proves that language access is not necessarily confined to a political party or a population size. It also leads into an important thing that language access can be fostered in neighboring communities and is a replicable and infectious policy. Brighton's neighbor, Ferrysburg, which is a town of only 3,000 people, also has a language access policy, and it mirrors Brighton's policy. Also on this, a great example from a city is from St. Paul, Minnesota, which ensures that infrequently spoken languages receive equal representation, that there are accommodations for people who speak frequently spoken languages, but there are also accommodations for people who speak infrequently spoken languages. So again, as inclusive as possible. Moving into some limitations from city examples. So vague and missing implementation strategies. Again, implementation is what it's all about. So San Francisco's police department's language access plan requires officers to attend a language access training. And while this is great in policy, in practice, it's only a 20-minute video. So really ensuring that we write as concrete of implementation and accountability measures as possible. So this moves into our overall recommendations. Successful language access policy and strategy is inclusive. It ensures language access for all LEP individuals, regardless of the frequency of their primary language in a particular geographic area or service population. It's built with accommodations for LEP individuals with limited literacy or whose primary language does not have a written form, or if they are not literate in their primary language. It removes digital and arbitrary boundaries for language access and reflects the service needs of impacted communities. Successful language access policy and strategy is also comprehensive. It's defined within explicit, inclusionary, and technologically aware terms. So again, concrete and comprehensive. And successful language access policy and strategy is impactful. It's developed with clear implementation and enforcement strategies within policy languages and practice. It's accountable through data collection processes like tracking communities served and public posting, so public accountability and public input. And that is an overview of our language access policy menu. I would love to hear your questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see all of you. If I can figure out how to do that. There we go. All right, so moving into questions in the chat. How would you overall rate California with multi-language accessibility, assuming rates vary within different counties? Joanne Delgado, U.S. Field Representative for U.S. Einstein. Okay, so I think, so yeah, it's difficult with California. California is really a special case because at least within our findings, it's been shown again and again that California really recognizes the ongoing process of language access. So again, edits that bill continuously. It's difficult to assess on state level with, of course, California is a huge state. So the population dynamics are really different in different areas. I don't know if I could give an overall rating. I think there are opportunities for things to be translated onto the local level. So of course you have these state policies, but on the local level, they might be missing. And then congressional recommendations, just supporting language access in any way possible. I think that language access is an often forgotten part of functional public policy and civil rights, but it's really important. And then moving into, oh yeah, very happy to send the presentation and the recording. And I can also circle back on anything that comes up. Do we have any more questions? Just give a little bit of time in the chat.
Thanks so much for that, Annie. And just to add, while we wait for any additional questions to come through, that this the recording for this will be made available and posted to the resource page of the Refugee Advocacy Lab, along with the menu of options that Annie has, the policy guide that Annie has drafted. All right, well, if there are no additional questions from the audience, I just want to say thank you to our speakers today, Annie and Sylvia, for sharing their experience and expertise. Thank you to the attendees for joining and dedicating some of your lunch hour with us today. We hope to hear from you as a follow-up to this session. If you are interested in pursuing policies in your own states, we are here to provide that support and guidance as you may need. Again, the recording and the guide will be available in the resource page, and for anyone, for everyone who registered, we'll be emailing this out as well. If this is your first experience with the lab, please do sign up for our email list on the lab website, or you can follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn. We'll continue to host these learning opportunities with the next one happening on December 17th, a policy summit that's focused on refugee and immigrant inclusion and workforce development policy at the state level. And I'll just do one more quick check if any additional questions have come in. That's no. With that, I'll let everybody go for now. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to being in touch with you. Have a great afternoon.